Our topic today is the very first assumption of Hinduism, namely the Brahman assumption. And what I wanted to do was to maybe do two or three things. One, tell you a little bit about the approach that I want to take to explaining this assumption. Number two, let us together try to understand what this assumption actually means. And number three, what the implications are. If we assume this Brahman assumption, what does that mean for us? What does it mean? For example, can Brahman walk? We should be able to answer that. If I come to Minneapolis, I'm currently in Dallas, I would certainly bring my heart with me, but will I be able to bring my Atman with me or not? When somebody dies, is it okay to say, may his Atman rest in peace? Is that an okay statement? How did Brahman become so blissful? We should be able to answer such questions. Is Brahman consciousness and existence, or is Brahman something that gives consciousness and existence? Those are two different things. For example, Higgs boson is not mass, but it gives mass to elementary particles. Bhagavad Gita says, for example, that Brahman cannot be cut. Even Sudarshan Chakra cannot cut Brahman. Gita did not say that, but it could have. And what does that mean? Does that mean that Brahman is something indestructible? What does that mean about Brahman? Why is that statement true? So, point is, we should be able to, after understanding the assumption that Hinduism makes about Brahman, we should be able to answer questions like this and many other questions. Okay, so that's one of our goals. Now, by my count, Hinduism makes half a dozen key assumptions. And on the basis of those half a dozen key assumptions, of which this Brahman assumption of today, that we are talking about today, is one. But on the basis of those half a dozen assumptions, we should be able to understand the main highways of Hinduism, the main highways, not necessarily every nook and cranny, but the main highways that define Hinduism. And what are these main highways? They include topics like Atman, Tattvamasi, causality or cause and effect, the creation hypotheses of Advaita and Dvaita Vedanta and science, human structure, reincarnation, karma philosophy, the subject of Varna, Chaturvarna, the ideal human being, Sthita Prajna, and, for example, Karma Yoga. So these are the main highways of Hinduism, and they, in my opinion, are all based upon less than half a dozen key assumptions. So if there is interest and if there is time in the future, we could get into some of those topics. So with that, let me come to how to deal with these topics. There are many different possibilities. One is an approach taken by Upanishads. Another one would be the approach taken by Bhagavad Gita. Another one might be the approach taken by physics or taken by mathematics, etc. Different approaches to explaining things. And so, what should we do here? What might be the best way to go about it? You know, in explaining Brahman, for example, one of the common approaches that I have heard in the past is the so-called neti, neti, neti approach, right? Neti meaning na iti, not this, not this, not this. So if you ask the question, is this laptop in front of me, is that Brahman? The answer is neti. Is this tree Brahman? Neti. And so on. And this is a great way to go about it. And it makes the point that Brahman is not an object. It is not a physical object. It is not a mental object. It's not like a thought. Thought would be a mental object. So Brahman is not an object. Brahman is the subject. So that aspect of Brahman gets very well explained in a way by using this neti, neti, neti philosophy approach. But I have found it certainly to be exasperating, to say the least, because it never comes around to saying iti. It would be ideal, I know it's difficult, but it would be ideal if there is a way of saying iti rather than neti. So we want to go in that general direction. So that's one thing. The second is the approach that is taken in Bhagavad Gita. And that kind of reminds me, you know, when as many of you know, I spent many decades in the Twin Cities and attended the temple there. And as we drove to the temple, there was a sign at the very last leg of the drive. There was a sign there that said, dead end. Many of you might remember that. Perhaps that sign is still there. I don't know. And it was the correct sign because that particular road dead ended at the temple. That's where it stopped. Now, some enterprising individual had put on top of that dead end sign, had put the sign of Hindu temple right on top of it. So it now looked like Hindu temple dead end. What does that mean? Does that mean that Hindu temple is a dead end? Or does it mean, for example, that when people come to a dead end in their life, they turn to Hindu temple? There could be multiple interpretations, and learning Gita often seemed like that to me, that there are many ways in which Gita could be and has been interpreted, right? Advaita Vedanta is one interpretation, Dvaita is another interpretation. Mahatma Gandhi had yet another way of looking at it. And perhaps Bharatiya Janata Party might look at it yet another way. Multiple interpretations. For instance, it says, and I want to quote it correctly, somewhere along the way, it says, weapons cannot cut it, fire cannot burn it, water cannot wet it, wind cannot dry it. It could have continued on any number of ways, saying hammer cannot flatten it, gun cannot shoot it. You can keep on going. And from this, we are supposed to figure out what Brahman is. That's a difficult task, right? That's a difficult task. And perhaps it has been done purposefully, but in any case, it is a difficult task. If, for example, we were to use that approach to teaching physics, It might go something like this. An apple fell to the ground. A leaf did the same. And lo and behold, it was a photo finish. And from this, we are supposed to figure out Newton's law of gravity. So this is exactly why we need a Newton to explain physics and we need Adi Shankaracharya to explain Bhagavad Gita. So this approach is very, very interesting, but it requires a lot of thinking, etc., and so on. So that is yet another way we could look at the subject of Brahman. But thinking about all of this, what I finally thought was that the best way to go about it is the way in which Euclid deals with plane geometry. That is yet another way of explaining things. And the way he goes about it is that he makes what I would loosely call a bunch of assumptions, several assumptions. For example, one of the assumptions is that a line has no thickness. Right? A line has no thickness. And one could argue that, well, if it has no thickness, it doesn't even exist. It's not even a line, and so on. But we are not supposed to do that. We are supposed to accept it as it is, as an assumption, and then move on. And then, as you know very well, all of plane geometry unfolds, one theorem at a time. Right. We could have made a different assumption that a line has thickness, but then if you do that, you would have to define what that thickness is. Is it constant in all dimensions? And then what will happen is that if you think about an area of a triangle, for example, there would be an internal area of the triangle and an external area of the triangle and an average area of the triangle. Life will get quite miserable. Many of us remember plane geometry as somewhat of a misery in any case. So when we think of the subject that way, we might ultimately conclude that this assumption that a line has no thickness is not too bad. I know it's not exactly practical, but it's not too bad. Maybe that's the reasonable thing to do. We can take a similar approach to Hinduism. That is to say, that we will start with an assumption. We are not going to argue whether Brahman exists or not. And did Brahman create humans or did humans create Brahman? We are not going to get into any of those arguments. We are simply going to say, here is the assumption called the Brahman assumption. Let's take it for granted. Let's try to understand it and see where that leads us. Right? And as I said earlier, a half a dozen assumptions like this it seems to me, it remains to be seen, but it seems to me should be able to explain most of the highways of Hinduism. So we are going to proceed in that fashion. The very first assumption, this Brahman assumption, what is that? It says, and this comes from the Taittiriya Upanishad, which is one of the top 10 Upanishads of Hinduism. It says that Brahman is Satyam, Gnanam, Anantam. Now, the way these words get translated, Satyam usually means truth, right? The ultimate reality. But in this case, we are translating it as existence. Why existence? Because It is the ultimate reality of everything that exists. So, Satyam is translated as existence. Gnanam means knowledge, but translated here as consciousness, because it is consciousness that makes knowledge possible. So, Satyam is existence, Gnanam is consciousness, and Anantam means infinite. Ananta meaning, Anta means end, Ananta meaning unending, endless, infinite. That is the assumption that Hinduism makes about Brahman. And we are going to take it as it is. We are going to try to understand what these words mean and what their implications are. But is this a reasonable assumption? I think that's a fair question to ask. Is it a reason? Just like we said, the assumption that a line has no thickness, is that a reasonable assumption or not? And we concluded, given all the other options, that that may not be perfect, but it's okay. We're going to live with it. In a similar way, the question is this assumption of Brahman, that Brahman is existence, consciousness, and infinite, is that a reasonable assumption? Because anything could have been assumed. For example, they could have said, Brahman is a magician. That's an assumption. He can do anything he wants. He can turn gravity downside up if he wants to, anytime. It's all magic. That's an assumption. Could have been. And we need to think about whether that would have been a reasonable assumption or not. Does that make sense or not? Another assumption could have been Brahman is in heaven and he only helps those who constantly praise him. That could have been an assumption. And the question is that assumption something that we see actually paying dividends in this world? So why make this assumption? So if we go back a few thousand years, I think what Hindu philosophers might have gone about is to say that they really wanted to explain what this universe is and how did it come about. Because because it's easy to think that there must be a creator for this universe. I mean, it's so beautiful and so vast, and right. And in fact, if we go back, we see things like the very famous Nasadiya Sukta, right? Which, very briefly, just one stanza of it says this: who really knows? Who in this universe may declare it? Whence was this creation? Who knows whence it arose? He from whom this creation arose, he may uphold it, or he may not. He who supervises this creation, he knows, or he knows not. So this is just a small piece of Nasadiya Sukta. But what it is saying, saying is that on the one hand, there is a feeling that if the food is a feast, there must be a chef in the kitchen, right? There is that feeling that there must be a creator. On the other hand, there is uncertainty as to whether this creator is really necessary. And there is some doubt as to whether we will ever find out. Right? A beautiful way of putting things. This is several thousand years ago. I don't think things have changed all that much in the last few years, few thousand years. You could still sing the same hymn today, even despite the progress of science over these many thousand years. So it is not unlikely that what they wanted to do was to explain where this universe came from and what did they see in that universe. They saw that it was something rather huge. In fact, Brahman actually means vast. So they saw something that was vast, that was very big, possibly infinite. And they saw that it had been around for a long time. They never knew a time when it was not there. Right? And that it was filled with innumerable objects, both mental and physical. They saw all of that. And these objects had existence, short duration, long duration. And some of them were conscious, like humans. So how do you explain all of this? And it seems very reasonable to define Brahman as something very vast. It had to be, if the universe is vast, anybody who created it must also be perhaps bigger. So it had to be vast, and it had to be something that gave existence to things, to objects, and that gave consciousness to at least some of them. So I'm not saying that this is how the assumption came about, but this is one way that I could think about how this assumption might have been formulated. And therefore, it seems reasonable to me to assume that Brahman is Satyam, Gnanam, Anantam. Because the chance of starting with that assumption and ending up with this universe as we know it is very high. Right? So let us now come to briefly what these words mean. Let's start with Anantam. Anantam means infinite, endless, right? Endless. Well, the sequence 1, 2, 3, 4, infinity is endless. But that is not Anantam. That is not the meaning, that is not what Anantam means. Right? Because a number like 1.5 is not included in that sequence. So that particular sequence is what we now call countably infinite, for which several thousand years ago they had a name called Asankhya. So I'm spending a couple of minutes on this because very interestingly, infinity back then seems to have been defined in two ways. One is Asankhya, which is countably infinite. And the other is Ananta, which is uncountably infinite. Includes a number like pi, for example. And it turns out that this uncountably infinite infinity, namely Ananta, is bigger than the countably infinite infinity called Asankhya. Now, all of this, from a mathematics standpoint, was only understood about 150 years ago by George Cantor, who showed that there are many, many different infinities, one bigger than another. But the reason I spent a couple of minutes on this is to say that somehow or the other, the topic of multiple infinities seems to have been, to some extent, dealt with long time ago. Okay. So Ananta means uncountably infinite. Well, uncountably infinite in terms of what? In three ways. Uncountably infinite in space. In space. Now, what does that mean? That means that not only that Brahman is infinite, but it is everywhere. See, infinite and everywhere are two different things, right? You can have something infinite, like Asankhya, that is not everywhere. And I could say that I have air in this room, everywhere in this room, but that is not infinite. So, infinite and everywhere are two separate things, and Ananta means both together, right? It's infinite and everywhere. It's inside an atom and in interstellar space. There is no place where Brahman is not, right? That's as far as space is concerned. Now, if I stay with just that, can you think about why is it that Bhagavad Gita says that Brahman cannot be cut? Think about that. If Brahman could be cut, what would that mean? What does cutting mean? Cutting means that you're creating a space, isn't it? If I take a steel rod and cut it into two, I have created some space between those two portions where the steel rod is not, right? So if I could cut Brahman, it would mean that I would create a space where Brahman is not. And that's not possible. According to our assumption, that is not possible. Brahman is always everywhere. So it isn't that Brahman cannot be cut because it is made of some sort of indestructible metal object or something. But it is this fact that our assumption is that Brahman is everywhere and infinite, which automatically means it cannot be cut. Right? Okay. So the second piece of it is that Brahman is infinite in time. It always was in the past, it still is, and it will always be. Infinite in time. So, what is the implication of that? If it is infinite in time, it means that it was never born. Because if Brahman were born, it would start somewhere, like all of us did. Right? It was never born, it will never die. That's just an interpretation. That's just an implication of this assumption that Brahman is infinite in time. It also obviously means that Brahman is the first cause of the universe. Assuming, of course, that the universe, came about as maybe science seems to think 13, 14 billion years ago, right? So that is the second piece of it. So Brahman is infinite and everywhere in space. It is infinite in time, and it is infinite in objects. Now, what does that mean? It is infinite in objects. Now, if all objects were physical objects, like the laptop, the table, etc., would you need that assumption that it is infinite in objects? I think the answer is no, because all of these physical objects occupy space, they occupy time. And if we have already assumed that Brahman is infinite in space and time, you it obviously follows that all these physical objects, it must accommodate all of those. So for us to say that Brahman is infinite in objects means there must be some objects that don't occupy either time or space. Only then would this third piece of Anantam would be an independent assumption. Otherwise, it just simply follows from the fact that Brahman is infinite in space and time. So that's something to think about. I'm not entirely sure, um, except to say that if we think of objects as unmanifest, perhaps they would not be counted in terms of space and time. Otherwise, everything else I can think of exists either space and time both or in time. So that's something to think about. So Anantam, Anantam means three things. It is infinite in space, infinite in time, and infinite in objects. Right? Three things. It also means that Brahman is right here, right now. Right? Brahman is everywhere, and it's always there. So Brahman is in everything, including you and me. We don't have to die and go to heaven to shake hands with Brahman. Brahman is right here. That's an obvious interpretation of the assumption that we have made. And the Brahman that is right here inside me is what I would eventually end up calling Atman. So that's another interpretation, another consequence of the assumption that Brahman is Anantam, that it is infinite in space and time and objects. It's in every object. Would Brahman have shape? Would Brahman have any kind of a shape? The, the answer is no. Because for one to have a shape, you and I have a shape. That's because we are finite. Right? To have a shape, that body must end somewhere. And so if you have Brahman that never ends anywhere, it cannot have any shape. And so we call it Nirakar. Brahman has been given so many different names. One of them is Nirakar. But it obviously follows from the fact that it is infinite. Right? So my point again is that we have made this basic assumption, and this assumption has consequences. Those consequences are just like proving little theorems in plane geometry. Right? You're not making any additional assumptions to prove anything. The proof just follows. Right? We often call Brahman Anand. You remember that the most commonly used terminology for Brahman is Sat, Chit, Anand, Satchidanand. That is not what Taittiriya Upanishad said. Taittiriya Upanishad said Sat, meaning existence, Chit, meaning consciousness, but it never said anything about Anand. It said something about Ananta, which is a different thing, right? Ananta is infinite. Ananda is bliss. So, how do we go from Sat Chit Ananta to Sat Chit Anand? Are we making yet another assumption that Brahman is somehow very blissful? Is that a new assumption? Or can you prove it based upon Sat Chit Anand? Right? Can you prove it? So let me leave that for you to think about. How to prove that Sat Chit Ananta automatically would mean Sat Chit Anand. That we won't have to make any more assumptions to get from point A to point B. Right? Now, one could argue eventually that Satchidananda has become more popular than Satchit Ananta from a marketing point of view, that if you tell people that Brahman is going to give them bliss, then everybody would want that. Right? But that's a separate issue. The issue here at the moment is whether one could prove by logic that Satchit Ananta automatically means Satchit Anand. Okay. So that is as far as Ananta, explanation of Ananta and what some of the consequences are. Now let's look at, we have two other things to talk about. One is Sat, meaning existence. And I think this is a difficult concept. I'm not saying that I have a great way of explaining it, but if you ask the question, what is it that is common to all objects? So I have this laptop, I have this light in front of me, I have a room that I'm sitting in, there is the trees outside, there is the whole universe. people, what is common to them all? What would the answer be? Right? Could we say matter? Of course, what is matter is another question, but there is something, some substance, something inside of all these objects, isn't it? Now, we know that matter is not homogeneous, but nonetheless, that might have been an answer. So the question they probably asked is, what is common to all these objects? If Brahman is in every object, it must be that which is common to all objects, right? Obviously, because if it isn't in one object or the other, then it defeats the assumption. So, what is it that is common to all? And not just physical objects, but also mental objects like thoughts and desires. What is common to them all? And the answer that they must have come up with is existence. Everything exists. The so called isness, if you like, is dash ness, isness. This laptop is, the thought is, the universe is, that isness. This concept of what is existence seems very difficult to explain. I think we might know it intuitively, but at least I find it not the easiest to try to say what exactly it is. Right? It is that isness. It has a time component to it. It lasts for some period of time. So it's temporal in that sense. Right? So the second thing that they came up with is this notion that this existence must be a feature, so to speak, of Brahman. The existence is everywhere. Even nothing, if you say nothing, even nothing exists. So existence is infinite. Existence is infinite in space. Existence is infinite in time. Existence is in every object. So it meets the Ananta criterion. And so possibly this idea of Sat may have come about. That Brahman is something that is, you could call it, Brahman is something that is existence, ultimate existence, and it gives its existence to objects. In other words, objects are nothing but existence itself. They just mistakenly or in an illusory fashion look like a laptop or people, but they in reality are existence. And some of the analogies given are often things like waves and the ocean, that waves are nothing but water, right? So that is one possibility, that Brahman is existence and gives its existence to others, which is the famous rope and the stick, rope and the snake idea. That it's really rope, but it looks like snake in the dead of night. It's really Brahman or existence, but it looks like people, right? That is the Advaita thinking pattern. Right? There is another way to look at it, which is to say that Brahman is not existence, but Brahman is some mysterious X that gives existence. If you see the difference, right? That gives existence. For example, let me see if I can. Yeah, here. I want to be reasonably correct on this. Here is what I wrote talking about Higgs boson. A close analog is Higgs boson, also called the God particle. It is associated with the Higgs field, which permeates all of space. As elementary particles, such as electrons, move through this field, they interact with it. When particles interact with the field, they gain mass. Is that resistance, right? By interaction is meant the resistance of going through that field, which appears like mass. The larger the interaction, the larger the mass, right? This interaction may be visualized as follows. Think of the Higgs field as a viscous medium that permeates the universe. Particles that interact with the field experience a strong drag from it, appearing heavier. A photon does not interact with this field and is massless. Photon has no mass, right? It is not that Higgs field gives its own mass to particles. It makes mass possible. So a analog would be that it is not that Brahman is giving its existence to us, but it is that it is making existence possible. That's an alternate interpretation. I don't know that that is a common thing that is in a part of Hinduism. But it could be. That needs to be thought through, and that one interpretation might be more appropriate for Advaita Vedanta, and the other, this Higgs interpretation, might be better suited for Dvaita Vedanta. I'm not sure about that, but that's something to think about. Finally, next couple of minutes, I want to close by talking about consciousness. So the question here might have been that, as I said earlier, Gnanam means knowledge. Gnanam means knowledge. And how do we gain that knowledge? We gain knowledge through experiences. Whether it is going to university or talking to people or whatever it is, these are experiences that give us knowledge. What is common to all experiences? Just as we asked the question, what is common to all objects? And the answer was existence. What is common to all experiences? What make these experiences possible in the first place for us? And that answer is consciousness. It is consciousness that allows us to have personal experiences. And therefore, Perhaps, therefore, the notion that Brahman is consciousness, Chit, might have come about. Now, I want to say that science looks at consciousness differently. Science looks at consciousness as an emergent property. I mean, most of the scientists, there are exceptions, but as the emergent property of evolution. That matter came first and consciousness ultimately evolved. Right? That's a different way of looking at it than Hinduism, which says that consciousness is primary, for one thing, because Brahman came first. So consciousness came first. And consciousness is everywhere, because Brahman is everywhere. So consciousness is inside a rock and also inside a human being. It is not saying that it is evolution that created consciousness, but that consciousness is everywhere. Now, it is true that rock is not able to demonstrate that it has consciousness. That's a different issue. Humans are able to demonstrate that they have consciousness. Rock is not able to. That's not because it doesn't have consciousness, but it doesn't have the physical attributes needed to demonstrate consciousness. Right? So science and Hinduism have a little different interpretation of what consciousness is. And there is also the idea that there may be a difference between what is consciousness and what one might call awareness. I am aware that I am talking to you. Sometimes my dog is more aware than I am. It can figure out another dog that is behind a building that I have no clue exists. So it's a matter of how we use these words, awareness, consciousness, whether they are the same or whether they are different, right? So that, I'm going to stop here in view of the time. That is what I wanted to say about Brahman, just to kind of summarize. Basically, what I said was that we want to take a certain approach to looking at these subjects, and that approach is similar to Euclid's approach to plane geometry. Namely, we will start with an assumption regarding each subject. So if we looked at, for example, reincarnation, there would be potentially an assumption that Hinduism makes about reincarnation. And so we start with that, and then we look at what is the consequence of that assumption. Right? That's the approach that we ended up taking. Thank you, and let me stop here with any comments you might have.
Anand,
Yeah.
it's a brilliant exposition. Thank you. Each one of us has to start thinking about it. And I'm glad you discussed this morning, and I'll hope you'll continue to discuss in the same fashion. Just to give the information, you probably already knew it, but for the other people might be interested in knowing it. We use the term Satchit Ananda, you're right. But the first time it was being used was in one of the Upanishads called Tejo Bindu Upanishad, which is written between according to some sources, 4th century CE, or other group says 100th century before BC and 20 CE. So before that, it was not being used. And people try to explain because of the ease of using Ananda and Ananta and difficulty of using Ananta in all the languages which come out of Sanskrit in Indian subcontinent, Anand has become more popular and has become, for marketing point of view, has continued Anand, as you rightly said. So just to complete what you talked about it.
Thank you.
Number 3 is, just like all scholars from time to time do, what Nasadiya Sukta did in the early part for Indian philosophy in Rigveda, 10:129, 1 to 29th hymn of the 10th mandala of Rigveda. Somebody, a brilliant man like you, one of the early morning after taking a bath and refreshing himself in Dallas, raised the question, where did all this all come about? And wrote that beautiful Nasadiya Sukta, who really knows, finally said, at the end, frustrated as he or she was, and said that, which is absolutely very understandable. But as it happens, from time to time, the scholars come about who try to explain it to make it easier for us to understand it. For example, as you rightly commented, all the key points that I wanted you to make, you did. And let me, before I proceed further, let the audience know that Anand was kind enough to share his notes of his presentation with me and a couple of other people on this group today. That made me easy to understand what a profound discussion that he had this morning. That's why I'm able to make these comments in the first place. The thing is, as you rightly said, after the initial confusion described in Rigveda, the scholars over a period of time, from time to time, came up with explaining how they saw it in their own mind through the deep meditation. So as you rightly commented, Satyam, Gnanam, Anantam, Brahma. Yah Veda Nitam Guayam Parame Yoman, basically describing in Brahmanandavalli in Taittiriya Upanishad. Brahman is the truth, knowledge, and infinity, as you described it. He who knows it, existing in the cave of art, in the transcendent Akasha, realizes all his desires along with omniscient Brahman. That's how the translation of that particular verse of the Brahmanandavalli is. Again, in Mundaka Upanishad, as you commented, Yaha Sahaya Havai Tat Paramam Brahma Veda Brahmaiva Bhavati. So basically, who knows this supreme Brahman invariably becomes Brahman. And of course, he goes on to say that it stays in the cave of the heart, Guhayam Guru Grantibhyo. And of course, in Chandogya Upanishad, Sarvam Khaluidam Brahman. So all these things you beautifully described, and really appreciate you making all those comments there. Now, a couple of more comments before I stop, because so many things to say about it. Because your notes are so exhaustive, you have to make all different notes at different places to make sure that I cover up as much as I can in a short period of time. With all that exposition you did to explain all the meaning of Sat, Chit, Ananda, Ananta, that was brilliantly done. I really appreciate it. It is very important for a inquisitive, intelligent mind like yours to raise those questions and try to find out answers for yourself. At the same time, an average person would have this question. Is it necessary for each one of us to spend our time and energy trying to understand the reason why those terms are used? Is it essential to go through such details to find a peace and happiness? My suggestion for myself is, if I'm not feeling good, I'm going to see a doctor who is expert in that field. I'm going to listen to him or her, take his or her advice, and whatever prescription he gives me, I'm going to use it to make myself feel good. So what I have done personally for myself, I found that all these key scriptures, Bhagavad Gita, Brahma Sutras, and all the important other scriptures, Vedas, have given me enough information to find peace and comfort for myself. So even though these are exciting, invigorating, giving my exercise to my brain, whether it is essential or not for a day-to-day man is something to be considered for all of us.
Yes.
One thing that I do from the practical point of view, the last comment, is that since I find the peace of all these questions, confusion as it is, in Bhagavad Gita, I continue to pursue that and find a comfort level for myself. I'll stop here, but I want to congratulate you for a brilliant exposition, and I hope that you'll continue commenting on this and make us think, because like exercises makes your muscle strong. By using the exercises of your brain, if there's a muscle in it, you'll be able to make us stronger. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Shashi. That was very, very useful to me, what you said. I completely agree with you. It all depends upon what your purpose is, right? I mean, there is a bhakti marg. So there is no need to even discuss anything at all. And one could simply uh, go that route, and that is just fine. I mean, in fact, a very large proportion of people are following that. So to me, it simply is your own nature, like swadharma, your own nature. If you are built one way or built the other way, uh, kind of determines maybe which approach you might want to take. So, it's not, is it absolutely essential for leading a happy life? I think the answer is no.
Personal exercise is important. Thank you.
By the way, talking about, you brought up the subject of Brahma Sutras. The one thought I had, and I don't know whether this has been done,
Huh?
is that it might be interesting for some enterprising young people out there who might look at this video, hopefully, um, to think of Brahma Sutras for physics,
Uh-huh.
or Brahma Sutras for chemistry or biology or whatever it is that you are interested in. How do you take all of that subject
Yeah.
or portions of the subject? Maybe it is just optics, whatever is your interest, and put it in this Brahma Sutra format.
Uh-huh.
Just the exercise of doing it, to me, it seems would be so beneficial, unless it's already been done, so beneficial to understanding what is the crux of the matter. And it would be kind of fun to have something called Brahma Sutras of science.
Well, you are in Dallas, you got students with you, bring them along. Well, as a matter of fact, one more comment is, he went about Ananta using as a fourth dimension. And since to cover up all the ends, we talk it, etc., 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 in order to cover all the dimensions which are known to us and unknown to us, Ananta is probably used.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So more than dimensions that we know. So Ananta encompasses everything along with it. So.
Um, well, let me repeat and say that I totally agree with Shashi that your presentation was brilliant and very penetrating and very um, inspiring. It raised a lot of questions for me, and one of them is this very common terminology, and you also used it at one point. You said Brahman is here. It's talking about Brahman being everywhere. Brahman is here inside me. And I thought, but that's inconsistent with um, with um, Brahman being everywhere. Because if Brahman is everywhere, then he's not present. He is who we are. It's not some kind of presence that's separate from you and me. Uh, is that not the usual interpretation that we are manifestations of Brahman? So to talk about Brahman as being present, but also accepting the perspective that we are Brahman, those seem inconsistent to me.
To me, it seems that one is an Advaita Vedanta interpretation, which is saying that everything is Brahman.
Mhm.
Not that Brahman is in everything, but that everything is
Yes.
Brahman.
Yeah.
Right? You and I are Brahman in that form of looking at things,
Right.
which is to me the analogy that of the snake and the stick,
Mhm.
pretty much. That we view each other as different because of a mistake or illusion or whatever you want to call it. We are all actually the same. That's one interpretation. The other interpretation could be similar to the Dvaita Vedanta interpretation, where you have something called Prakriti, which is basically material entity that is getting transformed with the help of Brahman, so to speak. And that entity is, that transformation is what we call universe. That's the current stage of transformation. So it is very similar in a way to science, saying that you started with something and it got transformed and transformed and transformed, and here we are, and it will continue that process of transformation. So now you have a situation where there is a material entity along with Brahman.
Mhm.
Brahman is continues to be everywhere because that's our basic assumption. There is no, there is no escaping that. And now on top of it, there is this something else called matter. And so now you do have Brahman inside that matter. For
So
example,
it's very easy uh, to speak from both starting points at the same time, isn't it?
I mean, it will be like space. Think of space. Now, space is everywhere. I mean, I'm not talking about the Einsteinian level. I'm just saying, ordinarily, the
Mm.
way we think of space, it's everywhere. Is it inside you and me? I mean, we are occupying space in some fashion. So, if in that sense, I'm saying that just as space is everywhere, including, in a manner of speaking, in us, in the same way, one could think of Brahman being everywhere, including inside of us,
But not being the same as we are.
but not being the same as, I mean, that could be another interpretation that it is the same as we are. And that's why I think we have this something called Advaita, something called Dvaita, some, etc., etc. because people are thinking of the same subject, the same words in Bhagavad Gita in different ways.
Yeah. 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 Thank you. Yeah, it's when as an outsider you start to read about these things, it 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 it's challenging to sort out what they are actually saying. You're very good at it. Because you're so systematic, but when you read most writings, it's not always very clear what assumptions they're making or what their starting point is or uh, even what specific phrases mean because the same phrase looked at from a different starting point could mean something different. So it's a challenge. Yeah.
Sometimes I feel they did it on purpose. Because, I mean, if you say it clearly, it kind of loses its charm. It's so, uh, when you say something in ways that people can interpret in different ways, it makes them think, you know.
Mhm.
So I think there are advantages and disadvantages both to that poetic approach.
And they're consistent with the Nasadiya Sukta.
Yeah, yeah. But I think that
My
is why
favorite.
mathematics is the language of physics, because it is so precise.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, as I say, thank you.
I I just wanna it's such a amazing presentation, Sasanga Anandji. I just wanna add or ask, when we bring this to an experiential level, that Jagrit, Swapna, and Susupti, the waking state, the dreaming state, and the deep sleep. The deep sleep is the one that is closest to realizing what that is, right? In a deep sleep, I mean, the time and space just stops. And, my wife sometimes tells me that, oh, you are sleeping for 4 hours, but it feels like,
Right,
less of us,
right.
such a blissful state that is, that, you want to go back again and again. And realizing Brahman, how I understand is that bring that deep sleep into the Jagrit, into the waking state as that, and how you, when you go into the finite mind, then the space and the everything exists. So is that how you, would you agree to that, being in a Jagrit, Susupti, basically, awake and in a deep sleep state is the closest we can get? Because as you said, there's no explanation of why this happened or whatnot. But when you come into finite mind, then you start seeing, okay, the space so would you agree to that? That should be our goal, is to bring that deep sleep into the awake state.
I I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that. My personal feeling is that in deep sleep, I have no clue what is happening. I mean, I could be, somebody might have given me anesthesia. It's the same thing in a way, right? You have a surgery of some kind, and from the time you smell something to the time you wake up, you have no clue what happened and how much time went. So I don't know what it means to experience deep sleep uh, in real life. I think there, from what I have heard, I have never experienced it. From what I have heard, people are saying that in uh, that what you're looking at is deep sleep, but with knowledge, right? That's a different state that I have never experienced. So I can't say, but they're talking about meditation being that kind of an entity where you have, quote unquote, the equivalent of a deep sleep, but you know about it. So whatever that combination is, that I have only heard that, I cannot say much more than that. I think another way I would have been to say that we kind of think in terms of if Brahman is consciousness, then we could start thinking about consciousness, right? That's something that we can, quote unquote, think about. I know that I'm conscious, etc., right? But that consciousness, which I have tended to call awareness, just to distinguish it from consciousness, that awareness, to me, it seems, is not identical to Chit, is not the same as Chit. If it were, we would have found Brahman. And I think there is zero chance of doing that.
Mhm.
So Chit is something different. And our, what we call awareness, I am aware that I'm talking to you, etc., or what is around in this room and so on. That awareness is what I would call conditioned consciousness.
Mhm.
That is consciousness that is conditioned by our body, mind, intellect, and vasanas. So your consciousness is different than mine in that sense. Or my consciousness is different from that of my dog. I used the wrong word. My awareness is different from that of the awareness of my dog, because his awareness is conditioned by his body and mind, or whatever he's got, right? The senses. And so, I mean, he can see around the corners, not see, but understand what's around the corners. I can't. So to me, it seems that one is pure, we might use the word pure consciousness, which is what the Hinduism's Chit is. And the other is awareness. And the Chit we are never going to find. There is a simple reason for this. I mean, when I say never going to find, I mean from a scientific way. You might be able to comprehend it or somehow in meditation figure it out or something, but it's not going to happen scientifically as hypothesis testing type thing. Because the hypothesis that Brahman is everywhere and always there and homogeneous, that hypothesis is such that it cannot be tested. To test an hypothesis, you have to be able to make a change in it, right? How do you test something that never changes? So we have zero chance, as long as we define Brahman the way we have. If somebody thought science is ever going to find that, I think that is no way that that's going to happen.
Yeah.
Science won't find it. Now, people might argue that I can intuit it, or I can maybe use some other means to figure it all out. That's different. Right? So that's a very long way of saying I don't know the answer to your question.
Yeah.
I might look
Thank
at it different way, Anand.
Okay.
Obviously, the question was asked to you, but I thought it may be important to make a comment. As you rightly pointed out in the earlier question of Johnny about Brahman being within us, and you rightly described that Brahman, yes, indeed, is within each and every one of us. In the context that you're talking about, continuous space is in each of the part, that is, we are each one of us. So the Brahman is present in each and every one of us. And just as he asked a question, in the deep sleep, your awake state is no longer there. That means you are no longer interacting with the objects around us, which makes our awake state. You are not interacting with your subconscious mind, where your mind creates the objects and interact with them. At that time, you're in deep sleep, where only your consciousness is at complete rest. Whether one recognizes or not, it's a fact that when you have a good night's sleep, you feel refreshed the next day. Just like your iPhone is properly kept on charge, you didn't forget it, it gets recharged next day morning.
Right.
So that Brahman that exists in each one of us is there at that time
Yes.
without any extrinsic negative influences, negative in the sense, talking about conscious word and subconscious mind can create covering of it. Talking about pure form exists at that particular time. Only thing that we have at that time is Brahmadya Avaranam Vidya. You got an Avaranam on the top of it, of our ignorance that we do not know. But since you're in contact with that Brahman within, you feel recharged the next day. I agree with your dog. He gets recharged to his consciousness level based upon his nature at that particular time. But consciousness, nonetheless, is the same. So whether you recognize it, what Brahman is per se, consciousness, Brahman, stays still within us and keeps on recharging us in deep sleep. So that's the way I look at it. It may be different interpretation, but that's the way I look at it.
No, I think I'm not disagreeing. Not only that the Brahman is there in deep sleep, it's always there. It's
Exactly.
there right now.
Except it's covered up with all the
But-
negative influences from outside.
Well, I mean, it's
Or
like,
negative. It's a different influence. I mean, I don't mean
Right.
negative all the time.
right. So it's always there. But if you can't hear him in deep sleep, what good is it? So that's the point I was making, that it still doesn't help me understand anything because I am so totally shot. So that's the
The
issue.
reason let me break it again, because one of the topics that will come up in the due course of time is talking about meditation and effect on brain. I'm trying to get all the technology articles pertaining to imaging techniques, where you're able to see the changes in your brain in deep sleep and otherwise, how it affects your growth of a certain tissue in your brain,
Yeah.
which is affecting that. So again, that is not a scientific proof the way you look at sciences. I'm looking from the way we can document certain changes occurring in the brain in certain phases, in certain state of mind. And of course, the clinical results, the improvement in the feelings and experience of the individuals. But again, it's going to be
Right.
somewhere down the road in our discussion. But I'm
Yeah.
glad it's a good question, and the way we look at from different aspects, probably the same way, but different words, I guess. Agree?
Yeah. I just wanted to answer that question I myself raised,
Uh-huh.
which was, how do you go from Anant to Anand?
Uh-huh.
Here is one way.
Uh-huh. I saw that. You're good. Good.
Yeah,
Good.
here
Please
is
explain it.
one way of looking at it. Anand means happiness, right?
Yeah.
I'm just looking at it purely from a practical standpoint. So if you ask yourself, when are you happy? Right? What makes you happy? And I think the general answer is when you get what you want.
Including pain?
Well, but if you wanted pain, then that might make you happy. So it's a question of satisfying your desires, right? Which is usually a desire for something, either a physical object, I want the best possible car or house or whatever it is, or mental objects, right? Remember, mental objects are also there. So when you are happy, when you get what you want, the problem is that you're not getting any one thing doesn't keep you happy forever, right? You get that, you have a momentary happiness, and then you're looking, hankering for something else, and et cetera, and life goes on. And what is being said is that if you only realized that you are your Atman, which is the same as Brahman. Brahman has every possible object inside of it. That if you realize that you are Brahman, you would know that you have everything you want. Everything is, all objects are right there inside of you. So the very fact that Brahman is Ananta, right, in the sense of objects, all objects it has, automatically means that is permanently happy. There is nothing he can't have that he already has, everything. So in this way of thinking, Ananta automatically means bliss. So that's one way to quote unquote prove it, if that's it.
No, I understand it. At the same time, I think since you raised the question
Yeah.
of getting the object and you're happy, the way we understand it is that your people who are Jivan Mukta are comfortable under any circumstance because happiness is their nature. For example, if we desire something, the desire for a particular object, when that object is received by you, the desire is no longer there. And that particular moment, when the desire does not exist to cloud your mind, your inner nature shows, which is happiness. You attribute that happiness to the object that you received, but what is showing at that time, Anand, is your true nature, which is Anand. Okay?
I would totally agree because my happiest moments come totally unexpected when I am not desiring anything.
Yep.
And something manifests and the joy erupts.
Exactly.